When President Volodymyr Zelenskiy stepped down at Hiroshima airport on the afternoon of May 20th, the news of his arrival at the G7 summit immediately became a global hot topic. This appearance also created some other rumors that after the G7 he would go to Beijing to meet with the Chinese president. If the above scenario plays out, it will certainly cause another diplomatic shock. The meeting with the Chinese leader would be perhaps more important to Ukraine than Zelenskyy's attendance at the G7. Mr. Zelensky arrived in Hiroshima on a French Air Force Airbus A330. Choosing a French plane to go to Asia, not the US, the partner that is supplying Ukraine's largest weapons, has implications. France has a better relationship with China than the US at the moment, especially after President Emmanuel Macron's recent trip to Beijing. It is beneficial once President Zelenskiy visits Beijing. If the above speculations are true, why is the leader of Ukraine determined to meet the Chinese president at this time, as well as why China refused? Let's find out in today's World Affairs. Right before his trip to Japan, President Zelenskiy met Special Envoy Li Hui in Kiev. Mr. Li is a special representative of the Chinese government for Euro-Asian affairs on a mission to connect the parties involved in the war in order to find a peaceful way to resolve the conflict. There is a report that President Zelensky and Special Envoy Li Hui discussed a visit to China after the head of the Ukrainian government attended the G7 summit. The French Air Force plane can carry Mr. Zelensky directly to Beijing, but such a trip would not be possible if Mr. Zelensky used U.S. military aircraft, given the current context of U.S.-China relations. Relations between the United States and France are shaky following President Emmanuel Macron's statements on the Taiwan issue. In an interview after a visit to Beijing, the French leader said, "Europe should not be caught up in crises that were not created by itself." He continued, "The US and Europe have a different approach to Asia. Europe should not be pushed deeper into the Taiwan Strait crisis caused by the US and China's overreaction." President Macron has made no secret of his displeasure, as France has to follow the lead of the United States, as Washington often opposes Paris having an independent foreign policy. On the morning of May 21st, President Macron happily stood next to his counterpart Zelensky before a special meeting of the G7 related to Ukraine. President Macron seems to be proud of France's important role in bringing Mr. Zelensky to Hiroshima. On the other side of President Zelensky was not President Joe Biden, but Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida, the host of the conference. President Biden stands next to Prime Minister Kishida. Mr. Zelenskyy's biggest purpose in G7 was to meet leaders of developing countries in the Southern Hemisphere. Many countries attend the G7 summit as guests, such as Brazil, India, Indonesia, or Vietnam. All maintain friendly relations with Russia and oppose economic sanctions on Moscow. One of Zelenskyy's accomplishments was meeting with Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol, Indonesian President Joko Widodo, and many other non-Western leaders. These are the countries in the group of 20 largest economies in the world. In the G20, China is the dominant voice, considered the most influential. On the afternoon of May 21st, after the G7 summit ended, President Zelensky went to the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Park and the museum next door, which preserves the memory of the 1945 atomic bombing. President Zelensky changed his outfit, wearing a black sweatshirt with the word Ukraine in white, instead of the signature khaki t-shirt. From the Hiroshima Museum, President Zelensky and Prime Minister Kishida slowly walked towards the memorial to the victims of the atomic bombing in 1945. President Zelensky later told journalists that the heartbreaking photos at the Hiroshima City Museum reminded him of Bakhmut, the eastern Ukrainian city, where fierce fighting has raged for the past 10 months. Today, Bakhmut is nothing more than a ruin, and no house is still intact. Mr. Zelensky's comments reflect a strong desire to see the war-torn cities of Ukraine one day bloom again, like Hiroshima. But to reach a stage of reconstruction, it is first necessary to end the war and to establish a framework that ensures long peace. This is not an easy path. A ceasefire without reasonable and certain terms could help the Russian military refocus and continue to attack in the future. According to some sources, during a meeting with Special Envoy Li Hui in Kiev, Mr. Zelenskyy proposed a visit to Beijing right after the G7 summit ended. The meeting with President Xi Jinping, possibly the most important event of Zelenskyy's first Asia trip since the outbreak of conflict. Speculation about President Zelenskyy's arrival in Beijing after the G7 summit dissipated when the French government plane brought him back on Sunday evening, May 21st. Some diplomats at the G7 summit said that the visit to China did not take place, possibly because some conditions were not met. For example, China does not yet feel Ukraine has goodwill about the 12-point peace plan. It is normal for Ukraine not to fully agree, but first of all, goodwill is needed on the proposals. In order to create an atmosphere of friendship, Ukrainian officials, such as advisor Mikhailo Podolyak, frequently criticize the proposal as an indirect cold shower on China's efforts. When receiving Special Envoy Li Hui in Kiev, the Ukrainian media may be ordered to only report on Mr. Li's meeting with Foreign Minister Kuleba, not to mention Mr. Li's meeting with President Zelenskiy. In international relations, it is quite normal for the higher level to welcome the lower, especially when the lower level comes from influential powers. Ukraine's move, not to mention the meeting between President Zelenskiy and Mr. Li, may make China unhappy. During the meeting with Foreign Minister Kuleba, Mr. Li hoped that the parties involved in the conflict should create a space for negotiations. Closing all channels of dialogue will bring many disadvantages and only prolong the conflict. In response, Foreign Minister Kuleba affirmed that they will not accept any solution that results in the ceding of land to Russia. The claim of territorial sovereignty is firm and unchanging. Another reason predicted by experts for the trip to fail, it was the G7 meeting. The industrial powers put forward many unfavorable views about China. The G7 agreed to maintain a tough stance with China in the joint statement. The joint statement has a content that said, "We are deeply concerned about the situation in the East China Sea and South China Sea. We strongly oppose any unilateral attempt to change the status quo by force or coercion. We reaffirmed the importance of peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait, which is integral to global security and prosperity." In economic issues, G7 also condemned China as unfair competition, non-transparent competition, oppression of foreign companies, violations of intellectual property rights, violations of trade regulations of World Trade Organization, or too much support for powerful state corporations, creating an asymmetry in competition. Conference affirmed that China is increasingly becoming the biggest challenge to global political and economic stability. However, the conference also commented that it is necessary to cooperate with China in many areas such as combating climate change, restoring supply chains, and dealing with the debt of poor countries. Mr. Zelenskyy's appearance at the G7 also created another great pressure on China. That was the international community paid more attention to Taiwan issue. Voices comparing Taiwan and Ukraine are increasing day by day. To protest the G7's position, China summoned the Japanese ambassador to Beijing, Mr. Hideo Tarumi, to express disappointment. China believes that as the host, Japan has promoted many unfavorable views about China. Chinese Vice Foreign Minister Sun Weidong expressed displeasure and firmly opposed with statements of the G7 summit. According to Mr. Sun, Japan, as the host of this year's G7, has joined hands with other countries to smear China through a joint statement in Hiroshima. This is an act of interfering in China's internal affairs, violating basic principles of international law, and harming China's sovereignty, security, and development interests. On the Taiwan issue, Mr. Sun said, the self-governing island is China's core interest, an unsurmountable red line. Taiwan should be reunited with the mainland, even by force if necessary. Mr. Sun also affirmed that issues related to Hong Kong, Xinjiang, and Tibet are China's internal affairs. No outside force is allowed to arbitrarily comment or interfere. In response to Deputy Minister Sun, Ambassador Tarumi said that unless China changes its actions, the G7 countries will continue to express common concerns. If China does not want these issues to be mentioned again, it should react more positively. Chief Cabinet Secretary Hirokazu Matsuno said at a press conference shortly afterward that Japan's foreign policy toward China is consistent, insisting on necessary issues and implementing steps to resolve disagreements based on respect. After the G7 meeting, the Chinese ambassador to the UK also asked London to stop slandering and smearing them in order to avoid causing further damage to relations between the two countries. While China is angry with the G7 summit, President Zelenskiy has shown himself as a star at this forum. This context puts China at an image disadvantage if it receives the Ukrainian leader in Beijing after that. Also at the G7 meeting, the US expressed some goodwill moves. For example, they are considering lifting sanctions on Chinese State Councilor and Defense Minister Li Jiangfu. The two sides are also arranging for the upcoming Shangri-La conference in Singapore. The US-China defense ministers will meet. The revival of high-level US-China dialogue, which is considered a welcome signal, aims to slow down or reverse the process of the two countries sliding to a breaking point, which could erupt into conflict. Some other comments said that China refused a visit of President Zelenskiy, possibly related to Russia. Russian Prime Minister Mikhail Mishustin recently visited China and met with top leaders such as Premier Li Qiang and President Xi Jinping. The biggest purpose of this trip focusing on economic issues. Mr. Mishustin attended the Russia-China Cooperation Forum in Shanghai. This is the place to connect and exchange between the business communities of the two countries. That is extremely necessary in the context that both are under a lot of pressure from the West. Western sanctions imposed further on the oil and gas industry caused Russia's budget deficit in the first quarter of 2023 to be around $40 billion, more than the whole of 2022 combined. More than ever, Russia wants China to buy more goods, especially oil, gas, and consumer products. In addition, Russia also wants to import from China materials that it cannot buy from the West, such as machine components or dual-use computer chips, both for military and civilian purposes. Some say that Mr. Stin's trip is to pave the way for President Vladimir Putin's visit to China. Putin's upcoming visit in response to President Xi Jinping's trip to Moscow in March 2023. If this visit takes place in the near future, it will be of great significance to both countries. With Russia, it shows that they still have a reliable partner in global economic and political affairs. Western encirclement and isolation will not succeed. With China, they show that they still have an important, friendly, and common interest partner. This partner is a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council. China's nominal allies today, such as Myanmar, North Korea, Pakistan, or Cambodia, cannot compare in strength and influence to Russia. It is possible for China that if they receive President Zelenskiy before President Putin in Beijing, it will not react properly to the relationship between the three countries at the moment. Since the war broke out in February 2022, China has maintained a neutral stance. Beijing does not condemn Russia or embargo Russia. On the contrary, it also strengthens economic cooperation, especially importing cheap oil and gas from Russia. This is also an important source of revenue, helping Moscow maintain the war machine in Ukraine. Therefore, Ukraine is eager to have an official meeting with the leaders of the two countries. Ukraine has repeatedly sent invitations to visit Kiev to President Xi Jinping. However, so far the direct interaction between the two leaders has been wrapped up in a phone call in April. Ukraine has many reasons to want to connect the two leaders more. If the face-to-face meeting takes place, it will be a great opportunity for Ukraine to present its plans to end the war and hope for China's support. Ukraine proposed a 10-point plan to end the war, but China did not respond. According to some experts, in China's view, Ukraine's plan has many things that do not match reality. For example, asking Russia to withdraw its troops completely before negotiating. This is impossible. A small country cannot ask a big country to condescend like that. If Ukraine wants Russia to withdraw its troops, it needs to fight on many fronts, such as military, diplomatic, economic, people-to-people exchanges, and needs support from the international community. Nothing comes naturally in this case. So such a firm and rigid request is not a wise option now. In addition, a face-to-face meeting will show that Kiev can connect with all major countries in the world, highlighting the image of Ukraine's diplomatic strength and encouraging Western countries to send more weapons. The meeting may also imply that whatever happens in the war, China will not react too strongly. Until now, President Xi Jinping is the only leader of a major country who has not met President Zelenskiy in person. Ukraine has many reasons for wanting to hold a meeting, but China also has many reasons not to rush to arrange. Both are cautious, carefully studying each step. Maybe the meeting will take place at the right time, but considering the current context, it probably won't appear in the near future. That has come to an end of our program today. Thank you for your attention and see you next time.